For years, they walked past him as if he were part of the furniture shadow in a gray jumpsuit, emptying the bins of the world's most powerful men. But during a billion-dollar merger in a glass-walled Manhattan boardroom, the quiet janitor did the unthinkable. He walked in, not with a broom, but with a stack of blood-stained truths pulled from the trash. In 5 minutes, empires fell. The man they ignored was the only one who could destroy them. Beneath the polished marble of Wall Street lies a labyrinth of discarded secrets, where the man who cleans the mess becomes the only one who truly understands the precarious cost of the game. The obsidian monolith of Sterling and Vance sat at the edge of the financial district, a vertical fortress of glass and steel that seemed to repel the very sunlight it reflected. Inside, the air was a climate-controlled, scentless void, filtered to a clinical perfection that scrubbed away the grit and desperation of the New York streets 30 stories below. It was a world of hushed tones, the rhythmic, predatory click of expensive heels on marble, and the low, electric hum of servers, processing fortunes in the blink of an eye. In this temple of high finance, visibility was a currency. If you weren't wearing a $3,000 suit or carrying a leather-bound portfolio, you simply did not exist. You were part of the infrastructure, like the piping or the wiring, essential yet entirely ignored. Elias Thorne moved through these corridors like a ghost in a machine. His gray jumpsuit was clean but faded, the fabric worn thin at the knees from years of scrubbing away the coffee stains of men who didn't know his name. He was a man of 60, though his eyes held the weary, analytical wisdom of a century. He pushed his rubber-wheeled cart with a practiced, silent efficiency, the squeak of the plastic muted by the plush, hand-woven carpets of the executive wing. To the junior associates and the senior partners, Elias was the man who emptied the bins. He was the recipient of their discarded lunch wrappers, their crumpled drafts, and their secrets. He was the invisible witness to the slow rot of human integrity. The evening was particularly cold, the Manhattan wind howling against the reinforced glass panes, creating a low-frequency vibration that Elias could feel in his teeth. The office was mostly empty, save for the occasional ambitious intern hunched over a glowing monitor. But the corner office, the sanctum Marcus Sterling, was still ablaze with amber light. Elias paused outside the heavy mahogany door. He could hear the muffled, frantic energy of voices inside, the sharp, staccato sound of a pen tapping against a desk. He waited, his hand resting on the cool plastic handle of his cart. Patience was his greatest virtue, a skill honed in a previous life that felt like a fever dream. When he finally entered to perform his nightly ritual, the two men inside didn't even pause their conversation. Marcus Sterling, a man whose face was a map of calculated aggression, was leaning over a sprawling mahogany desk. Opposite him sat Julian Vane, a sleek, serpentine lawyer whose smile never reached his eyes. Between them lay the Blue Ledger, a digital tablet displaying the projections for the upcoming merger with Nord. It was a billion-dollar deal, a transaction that would reshape the market. The redundancy is the key. "Julian!" Sterling hissed, his voice like dry parchment. "If we bury the debt in the offshore accounts before the audit, the merger goes through without a whisper. Once the ink is dry, Nord Global inherits the shell, and we walk away with the liquidity. It's a ghost trade. Clean. Inexorable." Elias knelt by the bin, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't supposed to hear, and in their eyes, he didn't. He reached for the black polyethylene bag, the plastic crinkling with a sound that felt deafening in the tense silence of the room. He felt the weight of the refuse. It was heavy today, filled with the physical evidence of a long day of deception. As he pulled the bag out, a single sheet of paper fluttered from the top, sliding across the polished floor toward Sterling's feet. It was a handwritten note, scribbled on a piece of hotel stationery, filled with a series of alphanumeric codes and a signature that made Elias' heart stutter against his ribs. Sterling glanced down at the paper, then at Elias. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. Sterling's gaze was one of pure, unadulterated indifference, the way a lion might look at a blade of grass. He didn't see a man, he saw a nuisance. He kicked the paper toward Elias with the toe of his handmade Italian loafer. "Clean it up," Thorne sternly muttered, already turning back to his digital ledger, "and make sure the shredder in the sub-basement is actually working tonight." Some of these drafts were barely touched. Elias picked up the paper. The texture was rough, the ink slightly smudged by the heat of a panicked hand. He didn't put it in the bag. Instead, he slipped it into the deep, hidden pocket of his jumpsuit. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sudden, sharp clarity of recognition. He knew those codes. He had seen that specific methodology of debt shrouding before. It was a ghost from his own past, a signature of the very fraud that had cost him his career, his reputation, and his life 20 years ago. He finished his round, the sound of his cart fading into the distance as he moved toward the service elevator. The elevator was a cold, metallic cage that smelled of industrial floor wax and old coffee. As the doors slid shut, sealing him in the vibrating silence of the shaft, Elias pulled the paper from his pocket. He smoothed it out against the stainless steel wall. The light of the elevator flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the page. It wasn't just a note. It was a roadmap. It detailed the exact transfer of $400 million into a series of shell companies based in the Cayman Islands funds that were being siphoned from the employee pension fund to cover the gaping holes in Sterling's personal portfolios. It was a crime of immense proportions, a betrayal of thousands of people who had spent their lives working for the very company that was now devouring their future. Elias leaned his head against the cool metal of the elevator. The hum of the building seemed to grow louder, a cacophony of greed and corruption. He thought about the small apartment he returned to every night, the shelves filled with old law books and dusty files that he could never bring himself to throw away. He thought about the man he used to be, Elias Thorne, the lead investigator for the Securities Commission. The man who had been framed for the very crimes he had uncovered. For 20 years, he had lived in the shadows, choosing the invisibility of a janitor over the scrutiny of a world that had condemned him. He had sought peace in the silence of the trash, but as he looked at the smudged ink on the hotel stationery, he realized that the silence was over. The trash had finally started talking back, and it was telling a story that only he knew how to finish. He reached into his cart and pulled out a small, battered leather notebook. He didn't need to look at the documents to know the next step. He knew where the bodies were buried because he had been the one forced to dig his own grave 2 decades ago. The merger was in 48 hours. The stage was set, and the man who cleaned the floors was about to decide who got to stay in the room. The sub-basement of the Sterling and Vance monolith was a subterranean cathedral of industrial neglect, a place where the pristine aesthetics of the upper floors dissolved into cold concrete and the rhythmic, guttural hum of the building's life support systems. Here, the air was thick with the scent of ozone, stagnant water, and the dry, chalky smell of pulverized paper. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a sickly green frequency, casting long, jittery shadows that danced against the damp walls like restless spirits. At the center of this cavernous room sat the industrial shredder, a massive, iron-toothed beast that groaned with a low-frequency vibration, a mechanical predator designed to turn the inconvenient truths of the powerful into a harmless, snowy confetti. Elias Thorne stood before the machine, his gray jumpsuit blending into the shadows of the machinery. His hands, shielded by thick, black rubber gloves, moved with a slow, forensic precision as he began the nightly sorting. To anyone watching, he was simply a janitor, clearing a backlog. But in his mind, he was back in the sterile, high-stakes atmosphere of a federal evidence room. He didn't just toss the bags into the maw of the shredder. Sifted. He felt the weight of each discarded folder, the texture of the cardstock, and the faint, lingering warmth of the ink. He pulled a heavy, plastic-bound ledger from the bottom of a bin marked for immediate destruction. His heart, usually a steady, muted drum in his chest, began to quicken, the rhythm stuttering like a skipped beat on a record. He opened the ledger, the sound of the binding cracking in the silence like a gunshot. His eyes scanned the columns of numbers to labyrinthine webs of debt swaps, the fictitious offshore entities, and the ghost trades that Sterling had boasted about only hours before. It was all here, the physical manifestation of a multi-billion-dollar lie, documented with the arrogant meticulousness of men who believed they were untouchable. Suddenly, the heavy steel door at the top of the concrete stairs groaned on its hinges. The sound echoed through the chamber, a sharp, metallic intrusion that sent a jolt of adrenaline through Elias's veins. He didn't panic. Panic was for the guilty. He moved with the fluid, practiced grace of a man who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of being invisible. He slid the ledger beneath a pile of discarded coffee filters and old newspapers, his hands steady despite the cold sweat beginning to prickle at the nape of his neck. A young man in a tailored, slim-fit suit stepped into the light. It was Thomas Porter, a junior associate whose ambition was as sharp as the crease in his trousers. He looked around the basement with a visible expression of disgust, his nose wrinkling at the smell of the industrial waste. He looked at Elias, his eyes barely registering the older man as a human being. To Porter, Elias was just another piece of the basement's grim architecture. Thorne. Right, Porter called out, his voice echoing with a hollow, privileged resonance. Sterling sent me down. He's paranoid about the Nord Global drafts. He wants to know if the 11 p.m. batch was cleared. He said you were falling behind on the sub-basement cycles. Elias looked up, his face a mask of dull, non-threatening compliance. He let his shoulders slump, his eyes taking on the vacant, tired look of a man who had long ago given up on his dreams. I'm getting to it, sir, Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The machine jammed on some heavy cardstock earlier. I'm just sorting the last of it now. It'll be dust by midnight. Porter lingered for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the pile of trash where the ledger was hidden. Elias could feel the weight of the silence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press the air from his lungs. He reached for a nearby bag and tossed it into the shredder. The machine roared to life, a deafening, metallic gnashing that filled the room, masking the sound of Elias's own ragged breathing. The mechanical violence of the shredder seemed to satisfy Porter, who nodded curtly and turned to climb the stairs, his expensive loafers clicking rhythmically on the concrete. Once the door clicked shut, Elias didn't move for a long time. He stood in the vibrating shadows of the shredder, his mind racing through the legal architecture of what he had found. He wasn't just holding evidence of fraud, he was holding the key to a global economic catastrophe. If the merger went through, the pension funds of 50,000 workers would be vaporized within 6 months. The scale of the cruelty was breathtaking, a cold, calculated theft of the future by men who already had everything. He thought about his own life, quiet, lonely years, in his small apartment, the way his hands felt permanently stained with the ink and the grease of other people's waste. He had spent 20 years in this self-imposed exile, a punishment for a crime he didn't commit, orchestrated by the same brand of corporate predator that now sat 30 stories above his head. He looked at his hands of a janitor, and realized they were finally clean enough to do the work of a judge. The night before the merger was a whirlwind of frantic energy. The building hummed with a different kind of electricity, the air upstairs thick with the scent of expensive celebratory cigars, and the nervous sweat of the underlings. Elias moved through the executive floor one last time, his cart heavy with more than just trash. He had spent the early hours of the morning meticulously organizing the documents he had saved from the shredder. He had cross-referenced the handwritten notes with the ledger entries, creating a devastating, undeniable timeline of the fraud. As the sun began to bleed over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, amber fingers of light through the glass walls of the boardroom, Elias stood in the shadows of the service corridor. He could see the bankers arriving in their black motorcades, the men in power suits stepping out onto the sidewalk like kings preparing for a coronation. They were coming for their billion-dollar prize, unaware that the man who had been cleaning their toilets was about to rewrite the script. His heart hammered against his ribs, a steady, inexorable rhythm of purpose. He felt the weight of the documents in the hidden compartment of his cart. They were heavy, not just with paper, but with the hopes of the thousands of people who would never know his name. He adjusted his gray cap, pulled the brim low over his eyes, and began the long walk toward the boardroom. He wasn't Elias the janitor anymore. He was the investigator, the witness, and the executioner. And the most powerful men in the city were about to find out that the trash never truly stays buried. The boardroom of Sterling and Vance was a cathedral of glass, suspended in the thinning air of the 38th floor, where the atmosphere was as cold and pressurized as the men who occupied it. The morning sun was a brutal, unblinking eye, its rays reflecting off the polished obsidian surface of the central table with a blinding intensity that made the surrounding Manhattan skyline look like a digital projection. Here, the fate of 50,000 lives was being signed away in a choreographed dance of ink and arrogance. Marcus Sterling sat at the head of the table, his gold-nibbed pen hovering over the final page of the Nord Global merger, a document that was more of a death warrant than a business contract. Beside him, Julian Vane adjusted his silk tie, his face a mask of predatory satisfaction, while the Nord Global representatives waited with a quiet, expectant greed of those about to inherit a fortune they hadn't earned. The air was thick with the scent of Arabica coffee and the sterile, metallic tang of digital success. They were seconds away from the completion of the greatest heist in the history of Wall Street. The heavy mahogany double doors, designed with a soundproofing that was meant to keep the screams of the market at bay, groaned with a slow, agonizing protest as they swung open. The silence in the room was not merely broken. It was shattered. Elias Thorne entered, his rubber-soled boots making no sound on the hand-woven carpet, creating a visual discordance that paralyzed every person in the room. He wasn't pushing his cart this time. He was carrying a simple, battered leather folder, the same one that had been gathering dust on the bottom shelf of his small apartment for 2 decades. The executives froze in mid-motion, their expensive pens suspended in the air. The junior associates stared in bewildered silence, their mouths slightly agape. To them, it was as if a piece of the office furniture had suddenly gained consciousness and begun to walk across the room. Thorne? Sterling's voice was a jagged glass edge, vibrating with an irritation that masked a sudden, inexplicable flicker of dread. What is the meaning of this? Get out. Now. Security is already on their way. He didn't look up, attempting to use his arrogance as a shield against the reality unfolding before him. But Elias did not retreat. He walked to the center of the table with a calm, measured stride, his presence filling the sterile void of the room. He placed the leather folder directly over the merger documents, the sound of the friction between the leather and the obsidian echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. I spent 20 years cleaning up your messes, Marcus, Elias said. His voice was no longer the gravelly, compliant rasp of a servant. It was the resonant, authoritative tone of a man who had once commanded the respect of the highest federal courts in the land. It was the voice of a ghost who had finally found his way back to the world of the living. I've seen what you throw away. I've seen the physical evidence of your cowardice. But some stains don't come out with industrial soap. They require a different kind of solvent. Julian Vane reached for the folder, his fingers trembling with a frantic, nervous energy. As he flipped open the first page, the blood drained from his face, leaving it the color of stale ash. It was the handwritten note on hotel stationery, the one Sterling had kicked toward Elias like a piece of trash. The next page was the detailed ledger from the sub-basement, its columns of dead shrouding and ghost trades laid bare. The final page was a formal deposition on Securities Commission letterhead, signed by Elias Thorne, lead investigator dated 20 years ago, and updated with the morning's date. The room descended into a frantic, low-frequency panic. The representatives from Nord Globo stood up as one, their faces twisted in a mixture of outrage and terror. Sterling's gold pen rolled across the table, falling to the floor with a dull, final thud that seemed to signal the end of an era. The merger wasn't just collapsing, it was being incinerated in real time. Outside the glass walls, the first sirens began to wail a rising, mournful crescendo of accountability that had been 20 years in the making. Federal agents, led by a woman who had once been Elias Thorne, Ere Protector burst through the doors he had left open. Elias watched the men who had thought themselves gods wither into the frail, terrified creatures they truly were. He didn't feel joy, nor did he feel the heat of revenge. He only felt the profound, quiet weight of a debt finally settled. As the handcuffs clicked into place, and the monsters of Manhattan were led away in a procession of shame, Elias walked out of the building for the last time. He left his gray jumpsuit on the floor of the locker room, a discarded cocoon of his former invisibility. He stepped onto the sidewalk in his old, threadbare wool coat, blending into the crowd of morning commuters. The Manhattan wind was biting and sharp, but for the first time in 2 decades, it didn't feel cold against his skin. He was a man with nothing in his pockets but a clear conscience and the memory of a truth told, and in that moment, he was the wealthiest man in the city. Integrity is the most powerful form of wealth. It is the only currency that never devalues, and the only fortress that no betrayal can breach. While the world may value the gold in the vault, history remembers the man who refused to sell his soul for a share of the spoils. Do you believe that truth always finds its way to the light, or are some secrets buried too deep to ever be found? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear that their integrity matters. Subscribe to Gilded Scraps for more forgotten truths from the shadows of our world.